They say Cleopatra died with an asp to her breast. But history, ever the obedient servant of power, often lies in whispers, not shouts. In 32 BCE, Alexandria was a city balanced on a knife's edge, the perfume of power hanging thick in the air, the streets ripe with rumor, and the waters of the Nile running slow, as if holding its breath. Rome watched, eyes narrowed. Octavian gathered ships, armies massed like thunderclouds, and in the heart of Egypt, behind the golden veils of the pharaoh's palace, lived the woman whom poets adored, priests feared, and emperors worshipped, but the Cleopatra the world knows, the enchantress in pearls, the serpent queen, the lover of Caesar and Antony, is only the version Rome wanted etched into marble. The truth lived behind doors sealed with ivory and guarded not by swords, but by silence. At just 18, Cleopatra VII ascended the throne, not as a girl, but as a goddess in flesh, draped in lapis and linen, bearing the blood of Ptolemies and the venom of dynasties that married brother to sister, crowned to madness. By the time Rome came knocking, she was no stranger to power games. She had already survived palace poisonings, exile, betrayal by her own siblings. The throne of Egypt was not won by birth, it was taken with blood. To her subjects, she was Isis reborn. To the Romans, she was a foreign seductress, a threat wrapped in silk. But neither truly knew her, because Cleopatra, behind those heavy cedar doors of the royal chamber, lived a life far darker, far lonelier, far more cunning than any statue could show. She did not sleep alone, and she did not always sleep with love. Her lovers were not only Antony and Caesar. That's the polished version, the version you tell the Senate or carve on tombs. But in truth, Cleopatra had an empire of men, advisors, generals, poets, slaves, not all willing, not all honored. Some came for favor. Others were summoned and could not refuse. A few left weeping. Many never left at all. The palace itself was built for it, long before her reign. A maze of corridors below the throne room. Mosaics of the gods, yes, but also of flesh, explicit, shocking, etched in gold and turquoise. There were rooms without light, rooms where screams were swallowed by silk. Rome accused her of worshipping strange gods. But what Rome called foreign, Egypt called ancient rites, and Cleopatra knew how to use those rites like daggers. There is a scroll, barely preserved, from a priestess of Hathor who claimed to witness it. A ritual not meant for public eyes. Cleopatra, bare except for a crown of obsidian thorns, dancing before a chained Roman envoy, his tongue cut to ensure silence, his body oiled, bound in offering to the goddess of pleasure and pain. It was not about sex. It was about control, because Cleopatra, unlike Messalina, did not revel in vulgarity. Hers was a colder lust, not for touch but for dominance. Her greatest pleasure was watching powerful men bend. And Rome gave her many. You know the stories of Caesar's arrival. The legend of her emerging from a rug, naked, defiant, irresistible. But what they don't tell you is how she tested him first. For 3 days, she left him in a chamber surrounded by eunuchs and incense, denying him her voice, her face, her presence. By the time she entered, Caesar was not a conqueror, he was a beggar, and Antony, the great general, he died not just for love, but from being slowly unraveled, stripped of honor, reduced to a shadow of the man who once routed armies. Cleopatra did not just seduce him, she unmade him, because in the royal chambers of Alexandria there were rules not written in Roman law. Men were not masters there. Cleopatra's lovers were not partners, they were tools, offerings, and sometimes warnings. But her secrets were not only of the flesh. Hidden deep in the palace was a chamber even slaves did not clean. A vault of parchment and blackened scrolls, written in dead languages, Syriac, Median, even older tongues. Whispers say Cleopatra studied arts that predated Egypt itself. Not magic, knowledge, forbidden strategies. Psychological tortures, mind games perfected in temples before the pyramids were even dreamed. She called it her weapon without steel, and she used it, oh yes. Did you know Octavian's spies went mad after weeks in Alexandria? Letters exist, hidden in Vatican archives, of grown men speaking in gibberish, clawing at their own eyes after being invited to one of her ritual dinners. She did not need armies. She ruled by fear and fascination, but fascination frays. And the higher the seduction climbs, the longer the fall becomes. By the time the war with Octavian loomed, Cleopatra was not merely a queen. She was a myth, dangerous precisely because she was unknowable. Rome feared her not for her beauty, but for what she knew, and what she hid behind those chamber doors. And the walls were beginning to crack, because behind the silks and incense, Cleopatra was slipping, a prisoner of her own games, a goddess who started to believe her own legend. And as every empire learns, divinity is the last illusion before collapse. In the final years of her reign, Cleopatra's power no longer walked through the marble halls, it stalked them. By 31 BCE, the city of Alexandria breathed under the weight of anticipation. War drums echoed across the Mediterranean. Octavian's navy grew like a shadow on the sea. Inside the palace, opulence still flowed. Incense curled in golden censers, wine spilled from Nubian glass. Musicians played their slow, haunting hymns, but the tone had changed. The luxury no longer spoke of confidence, but desperation. It was too much, too often, like a feast before a funeral. And Cleopatra, she had become something else entirely. Those closest to her claimed she no longer slept. Not truly. Some nights she would sit for hours by the window, wrapped in leopard skins, eyes fixed on the harbor, speaking to no one. Other nights she'd summon her attendants, 20, sometimes 30 at once, not to serve, but to watch. She made them observe as she reenacted rituals from the Book of Thoth, ancient rites designed to control men's hearts and bend fate to her will. She'd whisper spells in Greek, then shift suddenly to the old Egyptian tongue, her voice rough and hissing like sand against stone. They called her divine. But divinity, in its truest form, is terrifying. Mark Antony, her great love, her Roman twin, had by now become a ghost of a general. Once fiery and wild, he was often drunk, his eyes glassy, his speech slurred, his hands shaking. Some say it was grief, others poison, but those who saw him up close knew the truth. Cleopatra unmanned him, slowly, gently, like the Nile wearing down stone. Every night he slept beside a queen, but every morning he woke next to a sorceress. He was no longer a warrior, but her familiar, a weapon dulled by devotion. She kept him not with love, but with control. Cleopatra's royal chambers were now a place of performance, not privacy. She staged scenes like theater. Once a senator from Cyrene was brought to her dressed in chains, accused of plotting against her. Instead of questioning him, Cleopatra made him watch as she took another man in front of him, a slave, oiled and sculpted, chosen for contrast. She never touched the senator. She simply watched him break, breath by breath, as he realized what humiliation meant in her court. The next morning, he kissed her feet and offered his family's lands without hesitation. No army was needed. Her weapon was shame. She taught her handmaidens to wield beauty as a blade. Girls as young as 14 were trained not to please, but to manipulate. They were schooled in anatomy, in touch, in timing, in the study of desire and denial. Cleopatra called them the quiet army. These women moved through Rome's visiting embassies like shadows, slipping into beds, into conversations, into secrets, and every secret found its way back to her. There are scrolls, now decayed and forbidden, that describe a map, hand-drawn by Cleopatra herself, of every Roman senator and general of note, with notations not of their politics, but their desires. Who favored boys? Who feared domination? Who harbored guilt for their dead wives? Who could be undone with just the right whisper? That was her battlefield. Not soil and sword, but mind and vice. But power built on secrets is always at risk of exposure. One night, a body washed up near the palace wall. A Roman soldier, half-nude, throat slit. His eyes were sewn shut with golden thread. Rumors exploded. Had he seen something he shouldn't? Had he spoken where silence was expected? The palace denied involvement, But the people whispered, "Cleopatra is turning to the old gods again, the dark ones," and within the palace fear began to fester. Slaves stopped meeting her eyes. Servants trembled at her approach. The once loyal eunuchs began disappearing one by one. It was as if even her own staff knew something was unraveling. Even the air inside the chambers changed. Guests who once left enchanted now stumbled out pale, trembling, whispering that the queen was not just mortal, that she had become something else, a living curse draped in silk, moving with grace. But hollow behind the eyes, some claimed she no longer bled. Even Antony, her last true tether to humanity, began to falter in public. At a festival, he forgot the names of his own legions. When a minor priest refused to kneel before Cleopatra, Antony ordered his tongue removed without instruction from the queen. He was no longer obeying her. He was mirroring her, and so the court began to rot. One governor from Judea, after a private visit, returned home and resigned his post. His letter read only, "I have seen the face of power, and it is not Roman." Rome, however, was not blind forever. Octavian's spies multiplied in Alexandria. Letters were intercepted. Reports flooded in of madness, of black rites, of the queen's growing obsession with immortality. Yes, immortality. That was the final transformation. Cleopatra, now nearing 40, feared age like a dagger at her throat. She began experiments, using the blood of virgins, snake venom diluted in honey, obsidian needles meant to pierce the skin, but leave no mark. One account speaks of her bathing in lion's milk every third night. A process so elaborate and rare, it drained half the treasury, but no potion can stop time. And death, real death, Roman death, was sailing toward her with Octavian's fleet. Still, Cleopatra did not flee. She did not beg. She prepared, and what she prepared was not surrender. The final days of Alexandria did not fall in fire, but in silence. A slow smothering, not the kind that comes with catapults or battering rams, but the kind that creeps in under silk curtains and poisons the air inside marble halls. As 30 BCE dawned, the once thundering city seemed to hold its breath. Ships stood still in the harbor, sails furled like wings folded for the last time. Markets remained open, but laughter had vanished. Even the statues of gods seemed to look down with suspicion. The people knew, everyone knew, Rome was coming. Inside the palace, Cleopatra had withdrawn. She no longer appeared in the council halls or at courtly dinners. Her face vanished from public view, but she was not idle. No, the queen was weaving her final web, threading together seduction, deception, and betrayal into a final tapestry of control. She met with no generals. She consulted no priests. Instead, she turned inward, toward her most private sanctum, a sealed chamber, accessible only through a corridor hidden behind a mosaic wall, where even the guards were rotated blindfolded, their names kept secret. Here, Cleopatra had built her last altar, not to the gods of Egypt, but to herself. The room was lined with polished obsidian, not gold, not marble, obsidian, dark, gleaming and sharp enough to reflect her face, not with flattery but with truth. And around her image, painted in red ink, were names. Hundreds, written in Greek, Latin, Egyptian, even the dead script of the Hittites. These were not prayers. These were victims. Every man who had bent to her will, every woman she had shamed, every noble who fell under her spell or was crushed by it, catalogued meticulously, their weaknesses noted, their sins recorded. This was not vanity, it was insurance. She knew Octavian was no fool, unlike Caesar, who desired her, unlike Antony, who needed her. Octavian despised her, not for what she had done, but for what she represented, a woman who ruled, not by sword or law, but by seduction too potent to ignore. And seduction to Octavian was an affront to order, so she prepared her defense the only way she knew how, not with armies, but with secrets. She sent coded scrolls to Roman senators, reminding them, gently, with phrases only they would understand, of the nights they'd spent in Alexandria's shadows. She offered ships to provinces still wavering in loyalty. She threatened and tempted in the same breath. Antony, meanwhile, had crumbled into madness. His last speech to the troops was nearly incoherent. His armor no longer fit. He raved of betrayal, of gods abandoning him, of hearing Caesar's ghost in the hallways. Cleopatra kept him close, but no longer spoke to him as an equal. At night, she allowed him to sleep beside her, whispering lies to soothe him, of victory, of glory, of Rome at their knees. But in truth, she was already building her tomb. Yes, her tomb, constructed not in some remote necropolis, but within the palace itself, a vast golden chamber, scented with myrrh, and closed off from air and time. Within its walls were statues of herself, dozens, each crafted to represent a different aspect of her reign. The virgin, the mother, the whore, the goddess, the witch. She believed legacy was not left behind, it was engineered, but Cleopatra's greatest deception was still to come. With Octavian's forces less than 3 days away, she summoned a messenger, a man from Octavian's inner circle, one of his favorites, known for his rigid loyalty. She had captured him weeks earlier and kept him hidden, untouched, unharmed. And now she sent him back with a single message: "I surrender not my body, but my throne." Come take it, it was a trap, but one lined with honey. The message rattled Octavian. Could it be true? Had the queen, proud and untouchable, finally bowed her head? He hesitated. A pause. Just long enough for Cleopatra to stage her final scene. She dressed not in royal regalia, but in mourning white. Her hair unbraided, her skin bare of cosmetics. Her wrists adorned not with bangles, but with thorns soaked in cinnamon oil. She stood alone in the hall of Hathor as her servants whispered her surrender throughout the city. It was not a surrender. It was theater. She needed Octavian to believe she was broken. Only then would he lower his guard. Only then would she have a chance to draw him into her final snare. But even queens cannot bend time. That night, Alexandria's harbor erupted in flames. Roman ships had begun the siege. Octavian, no longer swayed by charm or caution, ordered the invasion. Inside the palace, Antony, mad with wine and fear, heard false rumors that Cleopatra had taken her own life. And with shaking hands and tear-soaked robes, he fell on his sword. The blade did not kill him. Not immediately. Bleeding and delirious, he was carried to her, half dead, gasping, begging to see her face. And Cleopatra, radiant even in sorrow, held him in her arms and whispered, "Rome has not beaten us. Only time has." Then, with Antony's lifeblood soaking the marble floor beneath her, Cleopatra knew there was no more escape. But she also knew there would be no capture. The queen had one final weapon. Not daggers, not armies, not beauty, a coffin of secrets buried within her chamber. And a box, sealed in wax, containing her last gift to the world. A choice. The palace walls had seen lust. They had witnessed betrayal, ecstasy, blood, madness. But as the dawn of August 12th, 30 BCE broke over Alexandria, they bore witness to something even more suffocating than death: irreversible silence. The siege was over. Roman banners now fluttered where Egyptian cobras once coiled. The streets lay in eerie stillness, painted with ash and fear. Doors were closed, temples shuttered. Priests stood with heads bowed, unsure whether to mourn a queen or a dynasty. Octavian entered the palace not as a liberator, but as a surgeon steps into a plague house, gloves on, eyes narrowed, lips sealed. His army trailed behind him, steel, dust, and disgust in their eyes. Rome had not merely defeated Egypt, it had dismantled a myth, and yet when Octavian reached Cleopatra's chambers, what he found did not satisfy him. The queen was gone. No fleeing, no resistance, no blood trail, just absence. A perfectly clean room, the scent of lotus still lingering. The bed untouched, her robes folded. No signs of struggle, no signs of surrender, just disappearance. He demanded answers. None came, but the eunuch Mardian, his face pale with dread, stepped forward and offered one word, whispered like a curse: the tomb. Octavian had heard of it, Cleopatra's extravagant final resting place, built not as a monument, but as a living archive of her reign. He had expected to visit it after her capture, to strip it of treasures, to carry its sarcophagi back to Rome as symbols of victory. Instead, he arrived too late. Inside the tomb, the air was dense and perfumed, suffocating in its richness. Incense coiled in the air like ghostly serpents. Lamps burned low with black wax. Statues stared with empty eyes. And in the center, Cleopatra stood, or rather, she had stood. She lay now on a stone slab, her arms crossed in the posture of pharaohs, her face serene but untouched by death's typical cruelty. No bloating, no twisting, no pain, only calm, like she had chosen her ending and choreographed it to perfection. Beside her, two handmaidens lay lifeless, one clutching her throat, the other frozen in prayer. On the floor between them, a small wicker basket. Empty Octavian stood over her and felt nothing, no victory, no triumph, just frustration. He had come to conquer a monster, a seductress, a sorceress, and now she lay before him, untouched, unreadable, untouchable. He ordered her body examined. No wounds, no blood, just a small puncture at the breast, so small it could have been a needle prick, or a serpent's kiss. They found no asp. That part, the legend, would be written later. Truthfully, even Octavian didn't know how she'd done it. All that mattered was that she had died before he could parade her through Rome. And with that, Cleopatra won her final war, but her death was only the beginning of the final corruption she unleashed. You see, Cleopatra had not gone quietly. In her tomb was not just gold and perfume, but records, scrolls, sealed wax boxes, names, Roman names, dozens, some from the Senate, some from the Praetorian Guard, some from Octavian's own camp, desires, secrets, weaknesses, letters in her handwriting, promising land, wealth, flesh, promises of betrayal in exchange for power. It was a blueprint of collapse. She had been playing her game far deeper than anyone imagined, not for Egypt, not even for Antony, but for dominion through shame. And now Octavian stood in a tomb, filled not just with a queen's body, but with the evidence of just how vulnerable his empire truly was. He ordered it all burned. Every scroll, every tablet, every name, the tomb sealed, the servants executed, the palace guards replaced with Roman loyalists. He couldn't risk even a single rumor escaping. But Alexandria had already begun to whisper that she hadn't died from a snake, that she had escaped into the desert, into a temple that only women could enter, that her death had been staged, that the body was a double, and Cleopatra had become a goddess, risen in flame. Rome feared her even in death, and still Octavian returned to Rome in triumph. He declared Egypt a province, called himself Augustus, built altars to peace. But behind the facade, he ruled with paranoia, because Cleopatra's chambers, those forbidden rooms of flesh, secrets, and ritual, had poisoned something deeper than politics. They had shown Rome what happens when one woman dares to use desire as a throne, and worse, when she wins. Rome tried to forget her, but forgetting Cleopatra was like trying to forget fire, not the warm hearth kind, but the kind that licks up cities and leaves nothing but bone and smoke. She had not just ruled Egypt. She had penetrated Rome not with legions, but with lust, humiliation, and terror wrapped in silk. In the years following her death, something strange began to happen in the empire. Whispers, not political ones, not public rumors, but private, terrifying ones. Intimate whispers shared between senators over wine, between guards behind temple walls, between wives in the dead of night. They said the queen's chambers still existed, that Octavian had sealed her tomb, yes, but had left one door untouched, a room hidden within the palace complex, unreachable by corridors, only accessible through a passage below the reflecting pool. Some believed it was superstition, others believed it was punishment, because men who had once served in Alexandria began to go mad. It started with dreams, men waking up gasping, drenched in sweat, claiming they saw her, not as she was, but as something otherworldly. Her face cracked like a porcelain mask, her eyes glowing with coal-black fire, her voice singing ancient songs in languages no Roman, had ever spoken. Then came the letters. One senator from Hispania received a scroll sealed in Egyptian wax, years after Cleopatra's death. It contained only one line: "I still know your shame." He slit his throat before his slaves could open the doors. Another, an officer who had escorted Octavian into the palace, disappeared during a hunting expedition. His body was found strung up between olive trees, naked, mutilated in a manner not seen since the old cult rituals of Bastet. On his chest was carved a single word in Coptic: servant. Rome began to realize they had killed the woman, but not the legacy, because Cleopatra hadn't just ruled from her throne. She had built a system, a hidden empire that fed not on gold or grain, but on humiliation. It was a power that didn't end when her breath did. It lingered in scrolls, in shadows, in flesh-bound debt. Some began to whisper that she had trained replacements, that her handmaidens, the ones Octavian hadn't executed, had scattered across the provinces, taking with them the rituals, the techniques, the blackmail records. Rome's wives began to act differently, bolder, more seductive, more dangerous. High-born women in Gaul were suddenly defying arranged marriages, running temples in secret. In Syria, a woman staged a fertility rite so violent and erotic it was declared blasphemy. And everywhere Rome saw her shadow, she became a symbol, not of fertility, not of beauty, but of something older and darker, of female dominance shaped through weakness, through whispers, through bodies turned into weapons. The cults began to grow, at first in private homes, ritual bathing, chanting. Honeyed wine passed from lip to lip. The reciting of Cleopatra's final prayers, not as mourning, but as initiation. Then came the masks, the serpents, the sexual rites in the name of Isis, twisted beyond recognition. Virgins offered not to gods, but to each other, and at the center of it all, always, Cleopatra, not as queen, not as goddess, but as doctrine. One text, known only as the Crimson Papyrus, surfaced in Numidia nearly 30 years after her death. It described in shocking detail the inner structure of Cleopatra's school of flesh, an alleged inner chamber where young women were trained to seduce, dominate and destroy political enemies through pleasure. The text had diagrams, names, techniques. Rome confiscated and burned it immediately, but the damage was done. Because by now the empire no longer feared Cleopatra the person. They feared the idea of her, the idea that a woman, any woman, could learn what she knew, could wield shame and submission like a general wields war. Octavian aged quickly. He grew suspicious of his own wife. He trusted no woman fully. His laws grew harsher. Lex Julia, criminalizing adultery, controlling female movement, desperately trying to stuff Cleopatra's ghost back into its sarcophagus. It didn't work, because it was never just her sex that threatened Rome. It was her clarity, her understanding of the one truth the Senate dared not say aloud: laws control men, but desire rules them. She had wielded that truth without mercy. She had made senators cry, made generals kneel, made emperors grovel. And even in death, she had left behind a map for others to follow. And so, decades after Cleopatra's death, her name was no longer a person. It was a warning, a shiver in the mouth of every Roman father when his daughter grew curious, a muttered curse among aging senators when their wives no longer obeyed. "Don't become a Cleopatra," they would say. But they said it softly, because to say it too loud was to summon her. Rome tried to bury her under laws, statues of virtue, and moral reform. But all that reform was a reaction to her sin, not sin as in debauchery, but sin as in the one thing men feared more than rebellion: female control without apology. The Empress Livia, wife of Augustus, was said to have once whispered to her physician, "He calls me his partner, but he sleeps with one eye open." Because of her, even she felt Cleopatra's ghost breathing down the marble corridors. But what the empire never understood, what it still doesn't, is that Cleopatra had already won. Not in life, not in death, but in transmission. The infection of her methods passed not through blood, but through curiosity. Especially in women, the empire underestimated. Somewhere in the eastern provinces, in an aging villa not far from Antioch, a freed woman named Thais, once a servant in Cleopatra's court, kept a locked box. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and cedar shavings, were scrolls stolen from the queen's tomb. They contained no maps, no military secrets, no treaties. They were lessons, pages of handwritten philosophies, rituals, aphorisms, and strategies written in Cleopatra's own curling, elegant hand. Not just instructions on seduction, but how to read a man's pride, how to unearth shame without saying a word, how to make him crave his own degradation while believing he was still in control. These scrolls would later be copied in secret and passed from woman to woman in underground circles across the empire. Not cults, not religions, quiet alliances. The new disciples weren't queens. They were wives of provincial governors, daughters of noble houses, mistresses to generals, priestesses in forgotten temples, women who understood the value of a whispered word at the right feast, a hand on the knee at the right negotiation, a promise withheld until obedience was absolute. They did not wear crowns, but they ruled men just the same. And as Rome expanded, so did the reach of her methods. In Germania, a chieftain's daughter named Adara seduced a Roman officer, then disappeared, leaving him disgraced and his cohort in mutiny. In Gaul, an elite noblewoman orchestrated the execution of her own brother using nothing but a dinner party and 3 carefully placed guests. In Egypt itself, women began staging private reenactments of Cleopatra's final days, not as mourning rituals, but as celebrations of rebellion. Meanwhile, Octavian, now Augustus, grew colder with every passing year. He passed more laws to control women, more limits, more punishments. But the more he tightened, the more enticing Cleopatra became. Even in death she drew people, not just in fear but in longing. Because Cleopatra had shown the world something Rome never wanted admitted, that the most powerful kind of empire is the one built behind closed doors, whispered into ears sealed with sweat, not blood. And somewhere in Rome, a boy, young noble destined for the Senate, snuck into his family's library and pulled down a scroll left behind by a cousin who'd traveled east. It was written in Greek, soft parchment perfumed faintly with myrrh. At the top it read simply, "Lessons of the Chamber." He read it. He was horrified. He was aroused. He was changed, and though he would never speak of it again, though he would burn the scroll 2 days later in a fit of shame, he would carry its message for life, that even the strongest man could be dismantled. Piece by piece, from within his own desire, Cleopatra's truth didn't die in a tomb. It was absorbed. Her chambers may have crumbled. Her statues may have fallen. Her body may have turned to dust. But her power, the kind that slips under the skin and lives in the bloodstream of a civilization, never left. It just went quiet. It watched. And it waited. Time did what it always does. It wore down memory, rounded sharp names into dull corners, swept ash under clean marble floors. 100 years after Cleopatra's death, her face was no longer carved into coins, her name no longer spoken in the Senate. Children in Alexandria learned of Roman emperors, not of the queen who once turned generals into lovers and soldiers into slaves of shame, but underneath the erasure, her legacy continued like a vein of poison beneath polished skin. The Cleopatran method, as it came to be whispered in the furthest provinces, became something more than history. It became tactic. Power passed not through official doctrine, but through inheritance of behavior. From mother to daughter, from servant to mistress, from courtesan to queen. And with each generation, the message was refined, sharpened, never declared, always practiced. It evolved. By 79 CE, in the years just before Pompeii turned to ash, the city was already suffocating in its own decadence. Brothels lined the alleys like temples. Murals of graphic acts were painted not in secret but in public. Senators visited villas with more wine than dignity. And the whispers grew again. There were women, they said, who were trained not in schools, not in temples, but in houses of pleasure that followed the queen's teachings. These women were not prostitutes, not entertainers, not slaves. They were strategists, deployed like spies, seducers, executioners. One such woman, known only by her house name, Lamia, was said to be the descendant of one of Cleopatra's priestesses. She lived in Pompeii's richest district, surrounded by silk-covered rooms, with doors that never locked and servants who never asked questions. She never advertised. She never sold herself. And yet the most powerful men in Rome made the journey down the coast just to spend one night with her. Not for sex, but for something far more dangerous. Confession. Lamia had perfected what Cleopatra had only begun, the art of unraveling a man not through pleasure, but through exposure. Men would enter her chamber armored in pride and leave it stripped of all protection. She knew how to ask a question without speaking, how to withhold just enough softness that it made even the most violent man beg for humiliation. One nobleman, whose name was removed from all records, was said to have confessed under Lamia's touch to bribery, murder and treason. The next day he withdrew from public life and sailed east, never to be seen again. But it wasn't Lamia that Rome feared. It was what she represented, a quiet return of something long believed buried. Roman men, especially those who had studied history, recognized the signs. They spoke of a disease infecting the upper class, women who no longer obeyed, daughters who laughed at arranged marriages, matrons who dared to desire control, and behind all of it, whether real or imagined, they saw her, Cleopatra, the queen who should have vanished, but who lived in every insolent glance, every strategic silence, every pleasure turned into power. A playwright even dared to stage a tragedy titled The Serpent's Bride, an allegory that painted Cleopatra as a spirit reborn in the daughters of Rome. It was immediately banned. The actors vanished. The script burned, but rumors said a copy was hidden beneath the house of the Vetii in Pompeii. Rumors also said that on the day Vesuvius erupted, several Roman nobles had gathered there for a final performance. None survived. The ash buried more than just flesh. It buried evidence, but as the empire aged, bloated on its own excess, new queens emerged, not in palaces but in bedrooms. Women who understood that power did not come from temples or votes or battles, but from uncontested intimacy. It is no coincidence that by the 3rd century, the Roman elite had begun marrying Eastern women, women trained in Greek, in ritual, in secret arts. Wives who did not speak in public, but ruled through their husbands? The pattern was too familiar. Even emperors began to fear their own beds. One general wrote in his campaign diary, "I've faced barbarians, but I fear my wife's silence more than a spear." Another, when forced to divorce a politically inconvenient wife, said, "You may remove her from my house, but I will never remove her from my will." And across the empire, temples of Venus began to change. Statues of the goddess bore not the usual innocent smile, but a sharpness, an edge. Some wore cobras around their wrists, symbols, nothing more. Until they weren't, because Cleopatra had taught a truth that all empires eventually learn the hard way, that you cannot kill what people secretly desire to become. And so her chambers, long buried in memory, began to open once more, not in stone, but in spirit. History ends things with periods, but Cleopatra's story ends with a pulse. It doesn't belong to Egypt anymore, or even to Rome. It belongs to the spaces in between, to the unrecorded, the unwritten, the unspoken. Her chambers, real or imagined, never truly closed. They were inherited, worn like perfume by those who needed her legacy most, the forgotten, the silenced, the underestimated. By the 5th century, Rome was no longer the Rome she defied. The empire had split, grown brittle, corrupt. Christianity had swept through the palaces, and the old gods were declared demons. Pleasure was shame, lust was sin. Power, if held by a woman, had to be cloaked in sainthood or silence. But even then, Cleopatra was not dead. Her memory flickered in monasteries, hidden behind false hagiographies. Her teachings slipped into herbal scrolls, masked as fertility rituals or healing baths. They survived in coded poetry, in women's stories. in songs sung while combing hair or weaving thread. In Byzantium, a courtesan turned empress named Theodora was rumored to have read a version of the Crimson Papyrus, handed down through Eastern priestesses. She ruled beside Justinian, but make no mistake, she ruled. And her detractors called her many things: whore, actress sinner, but in whispers some called her Cleopatra reborn. In Persia, a noblewoman known as Sahira blackmailed entire royal households using only letters, dinner invitations, and a knowledge of men's private appetites that no tutor could have taught her. She claimed to have studied under an older woman from Alexandria who taught her how to read body language better than scripture. And in the shadowy courts of medieval Europe, secret female societies emerged: the Daughters of the Chamber, the Order of Veils, the Silk Circle. No one dared link them to Cleopatra by name, but their practices, their methods, they echoed hers. Even the Inquisition, that brutal machinery of male fear, sometimes stumbled across women who didn't worship Satan or practice witchcraft, but simply understood too much, knew the right words, the right touches, the right way to unman a priest without ever lifting a weapon. Those women burned, but their ashes carried whispers of Alexandria. And in every age that followed, whenever a woman dared to rule through desire, not by asking, but by taking, they remembered her in brothels lit by gaslight, in salons lined with velvet and wine, in film reels hidden in vaults, in literature too scandalous to print. And now she lives digitally, in forums, in online confessionals, in the DMs of billionaires who believe they are untouchable until one sentence makes them tremble. Her lessons have become algorithmic because the truth she taught is timeless. Men crave power until it is used against them by the very thing they thought they owned. She proved that seduction wasn't a weapon, it was an empire, that the bedchamber could be a throne room, the body a scepter, and shame a sword sharper than steel. And so, centuries after her death in the ruins of Alexandria, where tourists click photos and tour guides mumble sanitized versions of her life, something lingers, not a ghost, not a curse, a presence. Maybe you feel it in your spine when you read too far into her eyes on a statue. Maybe it stirs when a woman looks at you not with love, but with calculation. Maybe you remember her when you see a man lose everything over a woman who never raised her voice. Or maybe you just know, deep down, that Cleopatra never died. She evolved. She slipped between the cracks of empire and entered bloodstream and bloodline. Her royal chambers, they never needed to be preserved in stone. They were rebuilt in minds. And every time a woman steps into a room and every man forgets his power just long enough to offer hers, the doors open again. They say empires fall with swords, but sometimes they rot from the bedchamber.